focus in on your specialty. What do you think is driving the contemporary obsession that we seem to have with, you know, zombies and serial killers and murder in general in American society?
Well, it's a fascinating study, I believe, to look at these issues, and there's nothing particularly new about this when I say that each decade, if you will, if you want to think about time in that easily measurable unit, there's nothing particularly unique to say that each decade gets the monster that it wants in terms of fiction. The way we make sense of the world, the way we construct meaning through stories, through narrative pattern. So there's always been a fascination with horror, with monsters, and there's something almost theological in their awesomeness, their awfulness, just the sublime terror and horror and anxiety that they can generate. So I think that when you look at a particular decade, it's really important to know what's going on culturally, socially, historically, politically, and you'll get a better sense, in my opinion anyway, of what's going on with the popularity of certain memes in the culture, such as the serial killer.
These serial killers today are very human-like. I mean,
Yes.
they have human attributes. I remember seeing Silence of the
Yes.
Lambs in the theater,
Right.
thinking to myself, that's a monster.
Yes.
But when you look at Hannibal today on the
Right.
NBC show, he's very human-like. He cries, he has feelings, he cares for other people. Do you think there's a danger in that type of portrayal? Maybe not a danger,
yeah,
but at least
right.
a concern, a red flag maybe?
Well, yes, to some extent. I do think that viewers are usually a little more clever than we give them credit for.
Sure.
I do think that these narratives, it's almost paradoxical. These narratives work very hard, and again, there's nothing new about this. You can see it in monster movies going back decades, King Kong being a great example.
Oh, right.
But you can see that the monsters, at one hand, they're presented as these larger-than-life, horrific, terrifying creatures. Even if they're human, they're presented as monsters in some way. They have powers that go beyond the ordinary. But on the other hand, there's this parallel, and indeed almost contradictory impulse, to try to make them identifiable in some way, that we have sympathy for the monster in one way or another. Hannibal Lecter seems very human in his present incarnation in the television show, but you can find the DNA of that in Anthony Hopkins' portrayal of Hannibal Lecter in The Silence of the Lambs, or even before him, the actor Brian Cox, who played Hannibal Lecter in Manhunter, which was the first screen adaptation of Red Dragon, Thomas Harris's novel Red Dragon. You'll find that, yes, they're presented in ways, they have powers, if you will, powers of perception, if nothing else, that are so much more acutely rendered than the typical person's powers of perception. Hannibal Lecter is very dangerous because of his powers of perception, and he's able to do things with them that defy ordinary human understanding. But on the other hand, he's also portrayed by both of these actors as having his human side, if you will.
His weaknesses or his
weaknesses.
faults. Yeah.
It's portrayed a little differently for what I'm sure will be obvious reasons as I expand upon it. It's portrayed a little differently in terms of his weaknesses in Red Dragon, or Manhunter, the movie based on Red Dragon. His weakness there seems primarily his obsessive desire to take vengeance on Will Graham, the investigator who brought him to heel. In The Silence of the Lambs, his weakness, if you want to call it that, or his human aspect, is the growing relationship he has with Clarice Starling.
Right.
He seems fond of her. It's almost a romantic kind of love from afar, which is really brought out to the fore in the following Hannibal stories, both the book and the movie Hannibal. And you see very much so how that develops into this quasi-romantic relationship in the movie Hannibal, and an out-and-out romantic relationship in the book Hannibal. So the DNA for humanizing the serial killer and its most recognizable fictional avatar, Hannibal Lecter, has been there. But now we're at a point in the development of the serial killer narrative where they are fully formed, round characters. They're not just evil. as I think you get a primarily evil portrait of Hannibal Lecter, as portrayed by Anthony Hopkins in The Silence of the Lambs, with some human elements. Now it's almost been reversed. You see Hannibal Lecter in the television series doing some evil things, but primarily he's presented in the guise of a mentor to Will Graham, even though we know as the audience what's going on, and we always did know, because it's based on Hannibal Lecter.
Right.
I mean, you can't assume people aren't going to know who he is.
Right.
So the audience is kind of in on the deception that Hannibal Lecter is wrapping Will Graham in the television show. But nevertheless, he's presented in primarily human-centered terms, and he's developing this relationship with his psychiatrist. He has his own psychiatrist on the television show, played by Gillian Anderson of X-Files fame. And that's a fascinating subplot, if you will.
Yes,
and there
I
seems
agree.
to be sort of a mentor relationship between her and him, with her playing the mentor. So it's a reversal of what we've seen with Hannibal Lecter before.
So go back just a little bit. You were talking about how when we humanize, what some of those implications might be.
The implications, I think, are fascinating from the point of view of identifying with characters that we would find reprehensible in most ordinary contexts. But fiction allows us to go beneath the surface, if you will. And fiction, whether it be in print or whether it be in a visual medium, we still are able to relate to these characters. Now, I find it fascinating. Others might find it disturbing that they're rooting for a serial killer. And maybe rooting is too strong a word, but because we're drawn into the narrative and because we sympathize with these characters,
There is
if they're
a
given these
connection.
human touches,
There's a
we do
connection.
sympathize. And
Yes.
I think in some ways there's almost a vicarious identification with them that, you know, as humans living in a social context, you know, we definitely have rules of conduct. We have rules of engagement for interacting with one another. It's what we would call decency or civilized behavior. But there's always that limbic part of us, if you will, that reacts to frustration and setbacks and obstacles, sometimes in very violent and what we would consider to be socially inappropriate ways.
It's the
And so when you
fantasy.
yeah, it's a fantasy. So when you see someone acting out what you know that you could or should never do, there is a certain visceral attraction to that. I don't think there's any real denying it. In some ways, it's a sort of savage wish fulfillment that these characters, and I think this is true of any, well, not any, but many fictional characters, that in some ways they're so much more clever and better looking and smarter
And richer.
than all of us. That,
They have the lovely
that we
job.
can dream ourselves into their lives, even if just for a few hours. But sometimes that has a very troubling aspect to it, at least for some observers, and that's this ability to identify with murderers. And I think what's fascinating about Hannibal, the series, and the Thomas Harris novels that they're based on, is you see that the identification of Will Graham, the investigator, he empathizes or bonds with these serial killers in the sense that he can imagine what they're thinking.
Yeah.
And by virtue of doing that, he is really almost against his will drawn into their world, and to the extent that he's very unstable. Now, of course, it's a very gothic kind of narrative. His identification is presented in these hyper-stylized, hyper-aesthetic kinds of terms. It's a very visual, of course it's a visual medium, but the way he projects himself into these worlds is very visual. And by so doing, we're drawn along with him, and we see what it is that he's identifying with.
Now,
and so he's the storyteller in a way.
He is.
Relating with
Sure,
these
he
killers.
is. What's interesting to me about Hannibal is, and clearly you know much more about serial killers than I do, but what's interesting to me about this this particular series is that it makes killing seem not so bad. You know what I mean? And so as a sociologist, my mind automatically goes
Right.
to this sort of very dark place where there are some people in our society that are watching this show
Right.
to get ideas. And what's problematic for me also is that most of the time the victims are young females. And there's the gender issue for me there.
Right.
There's the violence issue for me there. And then I realize as I'm watching the show that I don't think what I'm seeing is all that bad. So somehow I've gotten the message that maybe some of that violent behavior or that thinking that's sort of outside of the norm isn't so bad.
Well, and I think that's, and I understand what you're saying, I do, and I think that is what the fine line that the writers, especially if they have any social conscience, what the writers need to concern themselves with, and I see it playing out in the story arc of Hannibal this first season, where Will Graham's identification with these murderers and his ability to visualize them gets him to the point where he is jaded to the power that they have. Jaded in one sense, because he almost has to develop a callus, if you will, to distance himself from what he's seeing.
It's the humanity.
Right. It is the humanity of it, and in some ways he has to become less human to work with it. And that profoundly destabilizes him because he's a profoundly empathetic individual, but he becomes so fractured in a psyche and trying to balance all these irreconcilable differences.
And so my question is, are there Will Grahams out there who are watching this show? And, what is the implication of putting that kind of cinema on television into everybody's home?
Well, it's an age-old question. I mean, of course, you probably remember in our philosophy class we were talking about Aristotle and the theory of catharsis. In other words, why are people drawn to tumultuously upsetting or violent kinds of stories? And again, there's nothing new about them. It's just that, perhaps our technology for presenting them has gotten to the point that it's a hyper-representation. And I think you see that in the visual aesthetic of when Will Graham in Hannibal is visualizing these murder scenes that he wasn't present at, that he can imagine himself into. And it's a very surrealistic kind of visual palette that we're presented with. So, I mean, you could look at it as it's cathartic, that maybe the secondhand or vicarious exercise of these savage wishes that dwell within the breasts of every human, maybe that's a way of exercising them harmlessly. That's the catharsis theory. There are those who worry that exposure to it desensitizes and actually leads people into maybe replicating or imitating the acts that they're witnessing. And this is a concern that you see with, I think, some serial killer fiction movies. I'm reminded of the movie Copycat with Sigourney Weaver in it, in which someone is replicating famous serial murders, doing it his own way, but still sort of robotically or slavishly following the script, if you will, he'd already been handed by real-life serial killers beforehand.
Right.
So I think serial murder narratives do play with this concept. I don't think that they give us any set answers in particular. I think they acknowledge the danger of it, much the same way that you're questioning. But I think many of them also do their best to, maybe they're not always successful, but I think they do their best to make sure to present that this is not an attractive lifestyle choice, and that there are consequences. I mean, Will Graham's life falls apart within the story arc.
Well, yes, and Hannibal, I mean, we see him, it's almost as if the human side of him is the side that is struggling.
Right.
It's the side that is fractured.
Right.
It's only when he's human, or displaying that human emotion, that we realize how broken he is, right?
Yeah, and he's extremely broken to the extent that by the end of the series, he's institutionalized. And if you see Hannibal, the series, as sort of reversing the serial killer trope we've come to expect with Hannibal Lecter. Hannibal Lecter is in the power position on the outside of the cell, looking in on Will Graham, institutionalized, much like Hannibal Lecter.
Fabulous last scene, right?
Absolutely.